In this presentation, we're going to talk about the introduction to life. What exactly is life? What are living things made of? How are they different from one another? How are they similar to each other? As you can see on this slide, there are a ton of things that qualify as living. The study of those living things is called biology. This study ranges from studying very simple one-celled organisms like this, which is an amoeba that you might find in pond water, to studying very complex multicellular organisms like these, this leaf or this insect or you or I. All living things, no matter how different they might be from each other, share some common characteristics. These are things that are true for anything that's alive, no matter what it is. One of those characteristics, and the most basic characteristics, is that a living thing is living if it is made up of units called cells. All of these pictures are examples of cells. Another characteristic of anything that's living is that it has the ability to reproduce. There are a variety of ways that something can reproduce, but if it cannot reproduce itself, it is not a living thing, even if it has some of the other characteristics of living things. A third characteristic is that living things are based on a universal genetic code called DNA. No matter what type of living thing it is, a potato, an oak tree, a human being, a cat, a dog, a snake, all of these things have their own DNA code found inside their cells. Another characteristic is that living things are able to grow and develop. To grow means to get bigger and bigger because cells inside the living organism are dividing into more cells. To develop means that the cells in an organism take on specific jobs. It's called specialization. So when a living organism starts out, all the cells look the same and do the same job. But as something grows into an adult or into a more mature organism, like you see these pictures of this chicken embryo, those cells become specialized to do specific things, like eye cells are specified to see, and heart cells are specified to pump blood, and things like that. All living things obtain and use materials and energy. For example, plants obtain and use energy from the sun to make food through a process called photosynthesis. Animals obtain and use energy from other animals or plants that they eat. Another characteristic of living things is that they respond to immediate and long-term changes in their environment. Here's a picture of a plant. You can see that this plant is curved. It's curved because the plant grows toward the source of strongest light. So if you put a plant in a dark environment where there is no light and then shine a light just on one side, the plant will actually curve toward that light. Another example of responding to changes in your environment is for your own eye cells. Your eyes, the pupils of your eyes, dilate when they're in dilate when they're in low light and shrink when they're in bright light. That's an example of a response to something in your environment. Another response, or any response, is a change by maintaining a stable internal environment. That process is called homeostasis. Homeostasis is allowing the organism to balance between their whole body or their cells and their environment. Here's an example. Your body needs to maintain basically the same temperature all the time, the same internal temperature. So, if your body is in a really cold environment, it shivers in order to bring its core temperature up. If your body's in a really hot environment, it sweats in order to bring your core temperature down. That way, your body stays basically 98.6 degrees all the time. Another example of maintaining homeostasis is through our nerves. our nerves react when they come in contact with something painful, like if you touched a hot stove. Another characteristic of all living things is that they evolve or change over time. So whole groups of organisms change as time goes on in response to the things in their environment. Now I want to focus on some specific details about the smallest living things, which are cells. So in this part you're learning about types of cells and the organelles inside them. There are two main types of cells. Cells can either be classified as prokaryotes or eukaryotes. Prokaryotes were the first cells to evolve, and eukaryotes came from those prokaryotes. So since prokaryotes were first to evolve, you can imagine that they're probably a little simpler. Prokaryotes don't have any nucleus. This is still a type of cell, but it doesn't have a nucleus to contain its DNA. Eukaryotes do have a nucleus. In a prokaryote, the DNA just floats around in the cytoplasm, but in a eukaryote, the DNA is contained in that structure called a nucleus. Some examples of prokaryotes are archaea and bacteria. You know what bacteria are. Archaea are similar to bacteria, but they've changed to be able to live in really extreme environments, like extremely hot or extremely cold environments. And examples of eukaryotes are animals, plants, protists, and fungi. So, what does that make you and I? Our cells are eukaryotes because they have a nucleus. The DNA is contained in that nucleus. To help you remember this, remember pro, no, and eu, new. Pro, no nucleus. Eukaryotes have a nucleus. Multicellular organisms. These are things that are made up of more than one cell, like a leaf, or a tree, or a human being, or a dog, or a cat. These organisms have to be organized into groups of eukaryotic cells. And if we look at that organization from smallest to largest, the smallest part of a multicellular organism is one single cell. If you take a bunch of those cells that do the same job and you compact them together, it's called tissue. Some examples of tissue that you have in your body might be nervous tissue, muscle tissue, stomach tissue. When you get a group of tissues together performing the same job, that's called an organ. So all the different types of tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue, can make something an organ like your stomach or your eye or your heart. Then when you get a group of organs together that do the same job, you have an organ system. You've learned about some of these in elementary school, things like the digestive system, the endocrine system, the nervous system, the musculoskeletal system, and the cardiovascular system. All these organ systems, when they are working together, create a whole organism. Now that we've talked about the organization of a whole organism, now let's go into one single cell and talk about the organization inside that cell, because they have their own internal organization. The organelle is a structure inside the cell that carries out specific activities for the cell. It's kind of like the organs of the cell. You'll need to know the following organelles and their jobs. You'll need to know the cell membrane, the nucleus, the mitochondria, vacuoles, a cell wall, chloroplast, and cytoplasm. The cell membrane. If you look at this picture, this diagram of the cell membrane is this whitish-brown colored structure that goes all the way around the outside of the cell. Think of it like the balloon part of a water balloon. This cell membrane holds the cell together, and it controls the passage of materials in and out of the cell. If you think of a cell like a city, the cell membrane would be the border of that city. Not a wall, just a border, kind of the outside edge. It still allows things in and out. The cell membrane is made of two layers. You can see these layers kind of broken apart right here in this part of the diagram. And those layers have two parts to them, the head and the tail of all these different molecules combined to make the two layers of the cell membrane. Other molecules, like these, fit in between those two layers, which kind of helps things go through the cell membrane at various times. Now let's talk about the nucleus. If we look back at our diagram of the cell, the nucleus is this purple structure inside. The nucleus is not actually purple, but just like when you're looking at a United States map where they make all the different states different colors, they do the same thing on a diagram of the cell to make it easier for you to see the difference between the organelles. So here's a closer view of a nucleus. This is the control center of the cell. It contains the DNA of the cell coiled up into chromosomes. That's what you see here that look like X shapes. If you're thinking about the cell like a city, then the nucleus would be the mayor's office. All the things that go on in the city have to come out of the mayor's office. All the commands, all the laws, everything that happens in the city has to come from the mayor. Now let's talk about mitochondria. In our overall diagram, here are the parts called mitochondria. And here is a transmission electron microscope photograph of a real-life mitochondria. This organelle turns broken down food molecules into energy. This is the place where cellular respiration happens. Cellular respiration is a chemical reaction that you're going to learn about very soon. And if you're thinking about the cell like a city, the mitochondria is the power plant for that city. It provides the energy. Now let's talk about some things that are not in all cells, things that are only in plants. The first thing is the cell wall. If you take a look at this plant cell diagram, this thick green, what looks pretty stiff, that structure is called the cell wall. It's rigid and strong. And if you think about plants, they don't have a skeleton to protect their insides like humans do. So instead of a skeleton, each individual cell in a plant has its own kind of protective covering called the cell wall. It also helps maintain the shape of the cell, otherwise the cell would just kind of be a big blobby thing and it wouldn't, this was what allows trees to grow really super tall. And if you're talking about a cell like a city, this would be an actual wall, something physical that was thick and strong. Then let's talk about the central vacuole. In the plant cell, you see there's a big space called a vacuole in the middle. Animal cells also have vacuoles, but they're much, much smaller. Here's a close-up view of a vacuole. The vacuole's job is to store food, water, and waste, but mostly water. As it stores water, it's kind of like a water balloon. It fills up with water and it pushes everything to the outside of the cell wall, which helps maintain the shape of the cell. It keeps it nice and full and rigid. If you let all the water out of a water balloon, then the structure is much more flexible. And you can imagine if that were happening in a plant, the plant would kind of fall over or bend over and die, especially if it wasn't a plant that had something like bark. If you think of like grass or a house plant. In the cell city, think of the vacuole like a warehouse that stores water or a water tower or a garbage dump. Another structure that's only in a plant cell is the chloroplast. In our big view, the chloroplasts are these green circular structures here. This is another electron microscope photograph of a chloroplast. Chloroplasts collect light energy to make sugar. They make the food for the plant. They contain a chemical called chlorophyll. And that chlorophyll is actually green, which is why leaves and stems of plants are green. And the chemical reaction that takes place here is called photosynthesis. So as we go further into this unit, you're going to be learning all about cellular respiration and photosynthesis as two chemical reactions necessary for living things. If you're thinking of the cell like a city, think of the chloroplast as a solar panel on top of a city building. It collects the energy and turns it into something useful. And finally, we need to talk about the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is not technically an organelle, but instead it's the environment where all the organelles are. In this diagram, it's everything that's blue. It's kind of the everywhere stuff. It's a clear jelly-like substance, and it surrounds everything. What it does is provide the proper environment for all of the chemical reactions that have to happen in a cell. If a cell was filled with air, the chemical reactions would not be able to happen. So instead it's filled with this cytoplasm. In a cell city, think of the cytoplasm as the environment, like the air or the water or the soil. If you have any questions, please make sure you send me a message.